Okay, in our last class, we talked about St. Bonaventure and his generalate, and then we looked at the time of following Bonaventure's generalate and the little things that happened within the order during that time period. And so what we're going to see now is what we call the spiritual quarrel. So it's the group of brothers we mentioned already, the Zelanti, who are now being called the spirituals, and their fight to live the original rule as Francis had written it, their fight to try to live what Francis had given to them and what came of it. It didn't end well for the spirituals, but their spirituality, or I should say their fight, has never ended. So these are the years 1274 to 1318. We're going to cover the years of 1274 to 1318. I think we can get through it in this class. So this overview of the spiritual quarrel. So the clash between the Zelanti, or the spirituals, and the community, who will be later known as the Conventuali, the conventuals, terms already being used. It was kind of quiet during the generalate of John of Parma until the death of Bonaventure. As I mentioned, we had, Bonaventure, who was living in the Hermitage friaries, yet building big friaries. He was the great peacemaker, creating this balance between the two. And so it created a calmness in the order, but it was a false calm, it was a false peace, because it was not based upon the struggle of actually going back to what Francis had given. So the ranks of the Zelanti, or the spirituals, began to be infested with the heresy of Joachimism. Now, we've mentioned Joachimism quite a number of times so far. So let's look at Joachimism, what he actually taught, Joachim of Fiori, okay? Fiori, Fiori, Fiorri, Joachim of Fiori. So he taught there were three ages. From Adam to Jesus was the age of the Father. From Christ to the time of the author is the age of the Son. And then the age of the Holy Spirit would begin. And the age of the Holy Spirit would begin with this radical revolutionary change in the church. No need for hierarchy anymore, church law or the sacraments. All will be replaced by the spiritual church, a new order composed of spiritual men, poor and lesser. They will set the guidance under the direction of the Pope. The third age would be heralded by the angel of the sixth seal. He would bear the mark of the living God, and he would bring the everlasting gospel to all people. And then the Holy Spirit will unfold the reign of liberty. And so it's easy, if you look at Joachimism and look at Joachimism's prophecies here, you can see the heresy in that there'll become this age of the Holy Spirit where there'll be, no need for hierarchy, no need for the church, no need for the sacraments, and so forth. And so at the same time, you can see some truths in the sense that you have the age of the Father, where the Son and Holy Spirit were not known prior to Christ. Then the revelation of Christ and his incarnation. So, okay, you can see the age of Christ. And then the knowledge of the Holy Spirit. Okay, kind of grab those ideas, but yeah, I can see where they're false and heretical. But, you can play with some of that, I guess, and say, okay, maybe you look at it into a different angle than what Joachim was saying. But here comes the problem for the spirituals. They start playing with those ideas, saying, okay, we see at the age of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, with their age of the Holy Spirit, this great renewal in the church. And they may not be rejecting the sacraments in the church, but they may want to play with the idea of this new revelation of joy within the church, this new time of the fire of living the gospel, right? They'll reject the heretical part and play with the stuff that they could play with. So you look at some of this stuff like the third age will be heralded by the angel of the sixth seal. Now remember the word seal. About the sealing of Francis's body in the great gift of the stigmata, given by the seraph, right, the sixth wing angel. He would bring the everlasting gospel to all people, and friars would say, hey, how about the rule? And then the Holy Spirit unveils his reign of liberty. So it's easy to see how certain friars saw this fulfilled in St. Francis, that they might be able to reject the heretical part and look for the parts that might be true. For example, the mark of the living God, as I mentioned, the stigmata, the everlasting gospel, the rule. And in St. Bonaventure's work, the Legenda Majore, with a focus on the seraph, this only added to the possibility of Francis fulfilling this prophecy of Joachim. Okay, maybe Joachim spoke some lies and some heresy, but maybe he spoke some truth about Francis and so forth. So through Joachimism, the term spiritual took on an ever new meaning. So in the beginning, the spirituals had to do with living the rule spiritually or literally. Now, as they begin to embrace this Joachimist thought and playing around with Joachimism, they talk about the spiritual church. The nickname changes to being about those who believe in the spiritual or age, or the age of the Spirit, where there's no longer a need for the institutional church and the hierarchy. Now, not that the friars held to that part of it, but because they're embracing Joachimism, which spoke about the new spiritual church, the nickname changes from being about living the rules spiritually, literally, to being spirituals, those who are embracing this new spiritual church. Okay? The papal bull, ad fructus uberes, ad, ad, fructus, F-R-U-C-T-U-S, uberes, U-B-E-R-E-S, U-B-E-R-E-S. This was published by Pope Martin IV. Martin IV, December 13th, 1281. Okay? Martin IV, December 13th, 1281. Pope gave this document, which gave the friars full permission to preach and hear confessions anywhere, at any time, so long as they advised the people to obey the precepts of the Fourth Lateran Council by confessing to a parish priest once a year. Then Pope Honorius IV in 1285-1287, he's Pope for 2 years, 1285 to 1287, extended their privilege to the point where they were exempt from all diocesan rules. The French bishops were in opposition to ad fructus uberis and wanted the people to confess to their parish priest once a year, even confess those sins absolved by the friars, right? So again, you have the spirituals rising after the death of Bonaventure, and then you have the order again reaching out for these privileges, being given more privileges, and the clergy are again reacting, particularly the French bishops. And the French bishops said the privileges would not extend to those sins reserved by the bishops. And then Pope Honorius IV died before giving them an answer. So the former Minister General of the Friars, Jerome of Ascoli, was elected Pope. Pope Nicholas IV was a Franciscan and refused the French bishop's request. So they requested, hey, we want you to clarify these requests, clarify these answers. And then Pope Nicholas IV decided not to. So later, Benedict Gaetani, a forceful person against the privileges, became Pope Boniface VIII. There's a letter story. Okay. In the meantime, during the pontificate of both Martin IV and Nicholas IV, who was Jerome of Ascoli, numerous infractions against poverty were happening in the friary. The placing of poor boxes in the churches to collect money, receiving alms at first masses, friars establishing personal savings, no more communal questing. Habits were made from expensive materials, exaggerated dimensions of the habit, these long sleeves and so forth. Sleeves were lengthened and wide, and hoods were very large and formed like bowls around the neck. Shoes and capes or amices were promoted more and more. These, looking in the kind of like more of these official flowing robes, more like a bishop than a friar. Books and other needs for buildings became part of what one could get from spiritual friend. So the friars got a reputation of being collectors of books. They began to build beautiful edifices to the friaries. The friars began to own properties and collect revenues. They accepted both annual and permanent incomes. A new privilege by Martin IV mitigated the practice of poverty and placed the administration of all goods and property in the hands of the friars. The friars could be considered the true owners of these places. So you see, with all these privileges and exemptions that would be given to the friars, the loss of poverty was out the window. And remember, poverty is the foundation core of the friars. Francis loved poverty, Lady Poverty. There's a beautiful, depiction of Francis wedding Lady Poverty. His embracement to truly live as a son of God, completely dependent upon the Father for all things. And that's the call of the Franciscan charism, is to be able to live in that poverty where one surrenders oneself completely and totally to the Father's love. Not just the one of St. Francis, but all of us, to proclaim to the world that God takes care of us. and being able to live the gospel, to go forth in poverty, to proclaim to the world that we have a loving Father in heaven who knows our needs before we ask. To take Jesus at his words and live in that poverty the way Christ gave it and the way Christ lived it. And that's what Francis wanted, not only for himself, but for all of us. And as he said, if it was true for him, why wouldn't it be true for others? Why should it not be true for us even today? And this is what was being lost just 50 years after his death, or 60 years at this point after his death. That embracement of poverty is being lost as the friars began to turn to all these other things. Okay? So then came this papal bull, Exultantes in Domino. Exultantes in Domino, by Pope Martin IV, January 18th, 1283. Exultantes in Domino, Pope Martin IV, January 18th, 1283. It said that the goods were the property of Rome. The friars could use a procurator. Provincials, custodians could dismiss a procurator at will. So you don't like the guy who's supposed to be managing the goods for you, you can get rid of him at will. Get somebody else in if you want to do more of your bidding. Terrible. Followed by a papal bull, Religionis Favor. Religionis Favor, by Pope Nicholas IV, November 22nd, 1290. This is the Jerome of Ascoli, the Franciscan Pope. Nicholas IV, November 22nd, 1290. It confirmed the papal bull Exultantes in Domino. Now, there were oppositions to the abuses, and the generals tried to correct them, but to no use. The greatest opposition came from the spirituals. Now, the spirituals, again, they just did not like this. They want to live the rule. They want to live as Francis gave it, and yet they're being forced to accept these things, and they're watching this happen to the order, and they just want things to go back to the way Francis intended. So what are the leaders of the spirituals? Let's look at some of the leaders. We have Angelo Clareno, who lived in the marshes of Ancona. Angelo Clareno. Peter John Olivi. Peter John Olivi in Provence. Urbatino de Casale. Or Urbatino, Urbetino. Urbatino of Casale. And he's in Tuscany. And they appeared at the next general chapter. And at that chapter, they retracted the statements they made in 1274 about the Joachim stuff. And they gained many sympathizers, and the spiritual ideas spread. So these brothers were able to communicate to the others the ideal of living the original rule as Francis gave it. And again, they were still tweaking from Joachim's thoughts, but they were not holding to the heresy. They were holding to the thoughts of Joachimism regarding the rule and Francis being the person marked with the seal and so forth. But the goal was not simply to inflict upon the church the heresy of Joachimism. Their goal was to try to get the brothers to see that they were to live according to the way God had given. And I think they were pulling the Joachimism thing and say, see, even God's supporting us in this prophecy by Joachim, which was probably a really dumb move. So in 1280, certain other leaders were sentenced to a long life of confinement. Okay, so Thomas of Tolentino, Peter Marcotta, Angelo Carreno, they were sentenced to a life of confinement. And they were eventually released by the Minister General Raymond Godfrey in 1289. So they spent some time being persecuted for these ideas of pushing the early reform, of trying to bring the order back to its original foundation. Now, Peter John Olivi in Provence was a man of great austerity, a character and nobility. He gained for himself many followers because he was able to communicate very well how the rule should be lived. And his theology was a little bit off. He wasn't the best theologian. And so Peter John Olivi is a great guy, not the best theologian, but he was trying, you know. And the Minister General Jerome of Ascoli, who becomes the Pope, wants to ask him to burn a treatise that Peter wrote on Our Lady because it was so off. And Peter obeyed immediately. You know, he didn't fight it. You know, he's an obedient friar. And then the community accused Peter's followers of Joachimism. And so they were thrown into prison, the friars. So Peter went to Avignon in their defense in order to fight and to defend his brothers. And Bonagrazia, who was the Minister General, sent Peter back to his provincial. So the General Chapter of 1282 made an examination of Peter's works. They looked at Peter John Olivi. Okay, this is what he's written. He's got all these followers. He's one of these spirituals. Let's look at these works. What's going on here? And they had him sign a statement retracting 44 propositions. And he obeyed until the 1285 General Chapter in Milan, where the friars were forbidden to read his works. So I'm not too sure, because I've never really seen Peter John Levy's works, exactly what they were reacting to, those 44 statements. Were they really heretical? They probably, or were they just kind of like, just not well written and didn't sound right? And were they really filled with Joachimism, or did these brothers just not want anybody promoting in any way, shape, or form a return to the original poverty, a return to the original life as Francis had given us? So the General Chapter of 1287 in Montpellier denounced Peter as the head of a heretical sect. Was he? Despite the controversies, Pope Nicholas IV had Peter named as the lector of the University of Florence in 1288. So how is it that Peter could be the leader of a heretical sect, have written such heresy and so forth, have his followers imprisoned, and then the Pope, who had been the former Minister General Jerome of Ascoli, now Pope Nicholas IV, assign him as the lector at the University of Florence? Figure that one out. So obviously there's internal struggles and fighting going on here, and a lot of game playing of whether or not Peter John Levy was a heretic or he wasn't, right? Or was he just somebody who stirred the pot and trying to get the brothers to go back to the original rule of life and was being persecuted internally? Being made the lector of the university in Florence was partially done with the hope of separating him from his followers. So if we move Peter John Levy to Florence, gets him away from the guys he's leading and talking to, that might help in keeping the peace and the order. So at Florence, Peter found himself in the middle of a mess. The spirituals of the Marches of Ancona, which March of Ancona is a section of Italy, had been suppressed. So they were no longer allowed to function, these guys who were trying to go back. They weren't allowed to live the rule as Francis gave it. They weren't allowed to live according to the Testament. So in 1289, Raymond Godfrey, the Minister General, he was elected General of the Order, replacing Matthew de Aquasparta. So in 1289, Raymond Godfrey was elected General of the Order, replacing Matthew of Aquasparta. And he was a friend of Peter Levi. So the new Minister General is a friend of this guy who's getting beaten around a bit. So immediately after his nomination, he visited the provinces of Florence. He went around to the Marches of Ancona and so forth. And when he came to the Marches of Ancona, he investigated the imprisonment of certain spirituals. And Raymond of Godfrey, finding out that the friars were imprisoned because they wanted to live the rule, because they wanted to live poverty, because they wanted to be faithful to St. Francis and following the Testament, this is what Raymond of Godfrey said, quote, "God grant that their crimes be my crime and that of the entire order." Isn't that great? Here's Raymond of Godfrey, who is the Minister General of the Order. He's visiting around. He's a friend of Peter John Levy. He's got a desire for the life. He's got a desire for early poverty and so forth. Finds out the friars were imprisoned in the friaries because of their desire to live the rule, and they wanted to live a stricter poverty. And he says, "God grant that their crime be my crime and that of the entire order." I want to kind of put that as a logo, across my room, the entrance to my room. God grant that their crime be my crime and that of the entire order. So Peter John Levy and the Zelanti leaders, the spiritual leaders, teamed up. Ubertino of Casale was teaching the Florence when Peter arrived. The group also made the acquaintance of Blessed Conrad of Affida. Blessed Conrad dropped studies and went to remain a lay brother. Blessed Conrad, he's a lay brother saint. And Blessed Conrad, he knew Brother Leo really well. Brother Leo, again, St. Francis' confessor and good friend. And Blessed Conrad had gathered the life prophecies and stories of Francis. And he drew a great distinction between the life of Francis and what the community had become. And he was a real zealot for the rule. And the spirituals looked to him as their inspiration. Remember, the 1280s now, they're 60 years away from the death of Francis. Okay? So here's Blessed Conrad, a lay brother who dropped studies so he could stay a lay brother, who knew Brother Leo, gathered stories and stuff like that, and prophecies from Brother Leo. And then Conrad had around him the spirituals, these leaders, like Peter John Levy and Ubertino de Casale, and fed them the information that he received from Leo and making that distinction between what the life was like according to Brother Leo and what they're living now. And so he just fed that desire for reform. He fed that desire to go back to the rule as Francis had given it. Not to settle for the privileges, not to settle to live with inconveniences, not to settle for living with the contemporary modernism that had been sneaking in there. He was trying to pull them back to the gospel life that Francis had given. And Conrad did, in fact, get involved. At the same time, Margaret of Cortona, the great Saint Margaret of Cortona, she's like the Mary Magdalene of the Franciscan order. She was a tertiary member, and she got into it with Conrad and told him to stay out of it, But Conrad, he loved the life. He was a lay brother, and he wanted to live the life and wanted the brothers to live according to Francis. So Ubertino of Casale became the leader of the spirituals. They looked to him to lead them and to fight the good fight for them. Meanwhile, Peter Olivi reworked the Joachimist thoughts. So he took Joachimism and began to play with Joachimism to try to use it as a means of trying to show how the order needed to return to the gospel life. And Peter rejected the reign of the Spirit following the reign of Christ. So he rejected that. He rejected the eternal gospel replacing the gospel of Christ. Reject that Joachimist thought. However, he accepted the division of the world into 3 stages and that of the church into 7. The 3rd stage of the world corresponded to the 7th stage of the church. The 6th stage was not marked by a new gospel, he said, but by the renewal of the gospel on the basis of the most high poverty of Francis. The 3rd age was to be marked by the practice of poverty. And St. Francis was the reappearance of Christ on earth. Not that he believed that Christ was reincarnated in St. Francis, but that St. Francis really lived the gospel life and reappeared as another Christ on earth. And then he said that his order, Franciscan order, those inspired by the Spirit would be the true evangelical poor, as prophesied by Joachim. And that they would be persecuted by the cardinal church, just as the Jews persecuted Christ. And he said, just as Christ was buried, so was the rule buried and deadened by commentaries and dispensations, mitigations, and privileges. So I like that. Like you say that Jesus Christ was buried, so the rule was buried and deadened by commentaries and dispensations, mitigations, and privileges. In one sense, Peter's very, 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 very right. On the other side, he's playing with fire. When you're playing with heresy, you're playing with fire. So the 3rd age would last for 700 years, beginning in 1300 with the crucifixion of the evangelical poor. That brings us to the year 2000, so we'd be living in this new era that he's talking about. Angelo Clareno and followers accepted this prophecy that there'd be this 3rd age for 700 years, beginning in 1300 with the crucifixion of the evangelical poor. In 1305, Ubertino de Casale reproduced the 5th book of Peter Levy's work, Arbor Vitae. But by this point, Peter Levy already died. He died in 1298. So 8 years after Peter's death, Ubertino of Casale reproduced the 5th book of John Levy's work, Arbor Vitae, or Tree of Life, Arbor Vitae. And his followers kept his thoughts alive. So we have this presentation of Joachimism, rejecting the heresy part of it and trying to bring in how Joachim was prophesying the world for the coming of St. Francis and those who would follow and be truly evangelical poor and the persecution of them. And, Peter John Olivi, I think, had good intentions, but he went to Joachimism and using this heresy to somehow try to explain with the friars the spiritual position. They probably could have had a better chance had they not played with that, Joachimism. So traditions of the spirituals. Peter Olivi learned polemics of Francis against studies from Blessed Conrad. Okay, so they had that sense of they were against the studies of all these universities and so forth. The Zelanti, the spirituals, passed on many anecdotes that enhanced Joachimism, as you just saw. A simple provision handed on by Celano concerning the laxity of the friars, that in days to come the friars will be more lax, not as they were in the older days. That's his 2 Celano 157. 2 Celano 157. And they saw this fulfilled in Pope Nicholas III and Pope Boniface VIII. So some believe that they distorted St. Francis, the spirituals. James of Massa had a vision of the persecution. So the more relaxation set in, the more the Zealoti were persecuted, the more the thirst to live the rule became. So the more there were relaxations, the more they persecuted those who didn't want the relaxations, the more the spiritual thought, the Zealoti, grew, the more the desire to live the original rule grew. Now, the ideals facing each other. Poverty was the basis of the dispute between the spirituals and the community. Poverty. The controversy was around the ideals of Francis for the life of the friars. Okay? The controversy was also around the ideals of Francis for the life of the friars. So there were two camps. The community, who had a great admiration for St. Francis, but followed the road traced out for it by the popes, who brought in the apostolic ministry, tempered rigor, and poverty. Okay? All the mitigations and so forth. That's the community, eventually known as the conventuals, who wanted mitigations from the rule, who wanted exemptions, who wanted papal definitions, and relaxed what St. Francis had given. They loved Francis, they admired Francis, but it was an admiration of Francis as opposed to a following. The second group was the spirituals, okay, or what was formerly known as the Zealoti, and they regretted the direction given by the popes that mitigated the life and gave these privileges. They followed the intentions of the founder without the decisions of the Holy See. They didn't feel that the Holy See was necessary to get their direction on it because the Holy See kept giving these privileges and exemptions that went contrary to what Francis gave. The differences with the community were based on 4 points. First, studies and learning. Studies and learning. So the spiritualists said that studies were fine so long as it does not inhibit prayer, just as St. Francis wrote to St. Anthony of Padua. The spiritualists were hostile towards profane sciences and philosophy. And they said book accumulation was against the mind of St. Francis. Few, poor, and necessary was their motto. And they said lecturers were too proud of their titles. Teachers, lecturers were too proud of their titles. Second point, practice of poverty. They said the rule rejects not only ownership, but usage as well. Things must be few and poor and necessary. They said regarding poverty, the rule excludes personal and collective ownership, something the friars had begun to do. They also claimed that food and clothing ought to be few, poor, and necessary. What's necessary? And they said there should be a limited and restricted use of things. And they certainly were going with the mind of St. Francis. They certainly, when it comes to poverty, were sticking to the rule and to the testament and everything we know about the example and writings of Francis. Now, the third point, the obligation to follow the rule and to observe the testament. The stigmata, they felt, was the divine seal on the rule. The testament, words, and actions of St. Francis were the only interpreters of the rule. You want to know how to live the life? Don't look for papal definitions to relax it and to mitigate it. Their thing was look at the testament, what St. Francis told us how to live it in a more Catholic manner. Look at Francis's writings, what he wrote in his letters, what he wrote in his admonitions. Look to his words, what he said. Look to what he did. Those should be the only interpreters of how we should live our life. Fourth point of difference was the value of papal definitions. The value of papal definitions. They believed that the papal definitions created decadence in the order. And it was a result of Coeli Longati because it did not make the testament obligatory. So the spirituals felt that because the order did not cling to the testament, or should I say that the Holy Father Pope Gregory IX did not make the testament obligatory to follow in Coeli Longati, this is what led to all of these mitigations, that they can ignore the testament, which clearly tells the friars how to live in poverty, and to follow these mitigations. They said the text of the rule was clear enough. They didn't need all these explanations. They said that these declarations, like Coeli Longati and so forth, were not observed any better than the rule was. And so the friars were not only ignoring the rule and the testament, they were also ignoring any decrees on it that led to any kind of a strictness of the life. So what good are all these decrees if all they do is look for mitigations even from those things? And they believe that exit quid seminat was the height of relaxations. They did hold that it is licit to follow the papal definitions and utilize their privileges, but they are not faithful to the rule. This is interesting. Ubertino Casali, the spiritual, said it's licit because ultimately the Holy Father has the say. The church has the final say over the charism. So they said it's licit to follow the papal definitions, and it's licit to utilize the privileges. Although it's licit, it's not faithful to the rule. It's not faithful to St. Francis. It's not faithful to the Franciscan charism. It can be mitigated. It can be give all these privileges and so forth, watered down. The church has every right to do that, he said. However, that's not fidelity to what Francis gave in the charism bestowed upon us. Interesting little definition there that Ubertino makes. Now, there were separatist tendencies going on. Those are the 4 points we mentioned. Okay, let me go over those 4 points again. The differences were 4 points: studies and learning, practice of poverty, the obligation to follow the rule and observe the testament, and the value of papal definitions. Okay. Now, there were separatist tendencies. The spirituals missed 1 point. They didn't consider Francis's submission to the church. They rejected the privileges but accepted Joachimism. That was a problem. You're rejecting these privileges, but then you're clinging to Joachimism, which has been denounced as heresy. And as I mentioned, by Margaret Gaetona, she basically took the side of the community, and Blessed Conrad took the side of the spiritual. So you had these two, a blessed and a saint of the order, one a third order member, one a first order member, going at it head to head. The only answer seemed to be a split. Okay, that seemed to be the only answer at this point. 3 papal bulls. I'm sorry. Let me back up here. Okay, we're going to back up. I just realized my notes here. So we're going to have, let's look at this, the chronological development. Okay, we're going to look at 1279 to 1305 real briefly, kind of review this, okay? So we're going to review the chronological development between 1279 and 1305. So we have the papal bull Qui Seminat by Pope Nicholas III on August 15, 1279. Okay? Between 1279 and 1283, we have Bona Grazia as the general. Then comes the papal bull Ad Fructus Uberes. Ad Fructus Uberes by Pope Martin IV, December 13, 1281. The papal bull Exultes in Domino by Pope Martin IV, January 18, 1283. Between 1283 and 1285, Peter John of Libya opposes exit as well as to any split in the community. Then Matthew of Aquisparta is the general from 1285 to 1289. Raymond of Godfrey becomes the general in 1289. Raymond of Godfrey is a rebel sympathizer. He likes the spirituals. He released Angelo Clareno and companions out of prison and sent them to Armenia to go be missionaries. They returned from Armenia in 1293, and the provincials would not have them back. So Godfrey released these. Remember, I told you that the spirituals were put in prison. Godfrey visited them, set them free from prison, sent them to Armenia as missionaries. They come back in 1293, and the provinces wouldn't have them back. So 1294, Pope Celestine V, a former hermit, and also a founder of the Order of Hermits, now called the Celestines, becomes Pope. Okay, Pope Celestine V. And so the spirituals saw Pope Celestine, this former hermit who becomes Pope, as the one fulfilling their prophecies of Joachimism. And so he was petitioned to allow the spirituals to split and to live the rule and call themselves poor hermits, as Celestines, the Pope's order. In 1294, Pope Celestine resigned as Pope. He's one of the 3 popes that resigned. Pope Celestine V resigns as Pope. He was succeeded by Pope Boniface VIII. And Pope Boniface VIII excommunicated Angelo of Clareno, one of the leaders of the spirituals. And then Angelo Clareno fled to Egypt. And Angelo Clareno demanded the resignation of Raymond Godfrey for protecting the spirituals. I'm sorry, back up. Boniface VIII, I should say, Pope Boniface VIII demanded that Minister General Raymond of Godfrey resign his office as Minister General because he protected the spirituals. And Boniface VIII nullified the privileges of Pope Celestine V and had the poor hermits back under the Minister General. So the Celestine allowed the spirituals to split and live the rule as poor hermits. And then Boniface VIII brought them back in, put them back under the order, and demanded the resignation of Raymond of Godfrey for protecting the spirituals. The spirituals, led by Urbatino, demanded the resignation of the Pope and stated that the abdication of Pope Celestine V was invalid. You have some of that going on today, whether people are wondering whether or not Pope Benedict's resignation was valid and whether or not Pope Francis is the actual Pope. We see some of that going on in the church today, right? It was happening back then when Celestine V, abdicated the throne and stepped down, and Boniface VIII became Pope. The spirituals, who were protected by Pope Celestine, said that Pope Boniface VIII's election was invalid. Okay, and then they later denounced Pope Gregory IX and Nicholas III as heretics. this group of spirituals. Now, the Minister General Gonzalo Balboa. I just call him Balboa. Sometimes I call him Rocky. Right, General Minister Gonzalo Balboa in 1304. He sentenced Urbatino of Casale to the Laverna Hermitage and told him to live there. In 1305, Pope Clement V established a commission of cardinals to examine Peter Olivi's orthodoxy and observance of the rule. Okay, now remember, Peter's already dead, but the Pope wanted to have it examined because it was causing problems in the order and therefore in the church. Peter John Olivi was not condemned. He was not condemned. So then the papal bull, Exivi Paradiso, Exivi Paradiso, but Pope Clement V, May 6, 1312. The papal bull, Exivi Paradiso, Pope Clement V, May 6, 1312. He established how far each precept of the rule was compulsory. Now, in this explanation of the rule, Exivi Paradiso, it said that there were 27 serious precepts. 27 serious precepts, 12 exhortations, 6 counsels, and 12 conditions for novices. This is probably a very, very good explanation of the rule, because what he did, he really broke it down. What is a precept of the rule? What has to be followed? What's an exhortation by St. Francis, where he exhorts the friars? What are the counsels of St. Francis, things Francis counsels the friars should do? And what are the conditions for novices? So if you go through the rule, and I challenge you to do this, to find the 27 precepts, the 12 exhortations, the 6 counsels, and the 12 conditions for novices. Maybe I'll present this later on, but right now we're just going to leave it at Exivi Paradiso by Pope Clement V on May 6, 1312, laid out the this beautiful, I think, very good breakdown of the rule, where it was finally carefully done. We looked at what was precept, what was exhortation, what was counsel, what was condition. Okay? Now we're going to do the last part, and we should be done. We should have the time to finish this. So, the spirituals in the split, 1309 to 1318. We're going to cover these last 9 years of this quarrel between the spirituals and the community. So Pope Clement V, who was Pope from 1305 to 1313, was at first lenient towards the spirituals. Okay, he was first lenient towards them. The spirituals won the favor of the kings of Aragon and Naples. So even the kings were getting involved. The king of Naples, the king of Aragon, they liked what the spirituals were saying. They wanted the friars to live according to the original rule of Francis and so forth. So various cardinals, and particularly Cardinal James of Colonna and Cardinal Napoleon Orsini, James of Colonna and Napoleon Orsini, they were also in favor of the spirituals. So the Pope decided to hold an impartial investigation. So in 1309, the Pope summoned the Minister General, Gonzalo Balboa, Rocky, the leading spirituals, Ubertino of Casale, and the former Minister General, Raymond Godfrey. Okay, so you have this meeting now. Let me give you the names again. You have the Minister General, Gonzalo Balboa. You have Ubertino of Casale, Raymond of Godfrey, and the other leaders of the spiritual reforms. So Ubertino directed the whole discussion on the community's failure to observe the rule, and he kept his Joachimist thoughts hidden. He even conceded to papal definitions, like I said earlier, basically saying that you can follow these definitions, and the church has every right to give definitions, explanations, and they have every right to give these mitigations, but it's not equivalent to living what Francis gave us. And during the final session is when the Pope issued Exhibi. So it was actually after hearing Balboa and Godfrey and Raymond of Godfrey and hearing what Ubertino Casale, the spiritual, had to say, that the Pope sat back, listened to it, and then published Exhibi Paradiso and broke down the rule into those 27 precepts, 12 counsels, so forth, 6 exhortations, and the 12 conditions for novices. Okay? So the Pope took the spirituals under his wing. So Ubertino of Casale did a good job. He won the favor of the Holy Father. And the Minister General Balboa visited all the provinces personally to correct abuses. So actually, whatever Ubertino had to say did affect Balboa in a sense where he went around correcting abuses. He did start to see that these guys may have had a point. And he dealt severely with abuses against poverty, hoping to deprive the spirituals of a reason to separate from the order. Okay? So it was this movement on the part of Balboa to try to bring peace to the order by correcting abuses. Thanks be to God. The spirituals in Tuscany began to appoint superiors of their own. When they were dispersed, many of them fled to Sicily and founded schismatic groups, and they were excommunicated. So you had the spirituals in the Tuscany area who just decided, heck with that, we're going to have our own superiors like their own superiors. And eventually they got, were told to stop this, and they fled, went to go live in Sicily, under be protected down there, and eventually everything fell completely apart. The spirituals of Provence also seceded from the order. When they were excommunicated by Pope John the 22nd, they appealed to the next pope. In 1317, this is the important point here, the Pope imprisoned 62 of the most troublesome spirituals. So although Balboa was trying to keep things calm and Balboa was doing his best to keep things at peace, Balboa was correcting abuses, the spirituals just had enough and were doing things that were just not cool, creating great problems. And so the Pope imprisoned 300 of the spirituals. They were stripped of their habit and refused confession and church burial. So the first 62 were imprisoned, and then 300. The papal bull, Quorundam Exigit, Quorundam, Quorundam Exigit, Exigit, by Pope John the 22nd, October 7th, 1317. October 7th, 1317. It was published during the trial of the spirituals and stated that only the superiors could make the decisions on poverty. So that was another hit to these spirituals. You had 62 guys, 362 guys imprisoned, right? Then came the papal bull Sancta Romana, again by the same pope, December 30th, 1317. A couple of months later. December 30th, 1317, just a few months after the previous. And this condemned the spirituals by whatever name they call themselves. So you had a papal bull directly condemning the spirituals. And again, like I said, 362 in prison. Of all those friars put on trial, the 362, only 5 stood firm in Joachimism. And those 5 were burnt at the stake. 1 received a life sentence. Ubertino of Casale became a Benedictine. Some say he was always a rebellious Franciscan, and he died in 1329. Angelo Clareno, who became a poor hermit. In 1317, the Pope ordered him to Subiaco. Here, he governed the Fraticelli della Povera Vita. He wrote many works, Angelo Clareno. He explained the conflict. He reacted to the accusations of the schism. and retained his attitude toward the church and the Pope. He had to flee to Basilicata in 1334, and he died in 1337 at the age of 92. So Angelo Carreno remained rather outspoken throughout all the time. Again, he wasn't sentenced to death. He never held to the craziness. He just wanted to live the rule, and he suffered for it terribly. His fraction continued in Italy under the name of the Clarini. They were severely persecuted by Pope Urban V. Several were burnt alive in 1367 and 1368. Pope Martin V expelled them from their convents in 1418. And then Pope Martin V, in 1418, he appointed Gianni Capistrano and James of the March to conduct an inquisition against these guys. They were reconciled with the church by Pope Eugene IV. Again, it took 100 years after Angelo Carreno all this is happening. And then Pope Sixtus IV in 1473 put them under the OFM General. And in 1517, they were amalgamated by the Bull of Unity. So you had the Clarini group that continued on the outside of the church, getting persecuted, this and that, and eventually, 200 years after the whole controversy, they're brought back into the order, But it didn't end well for the spirituals, And probably the biggest fault was that they were trying to adopt Joachimism and somehow use this heresy of Joachimism, the things that Joachim said, probably because he was so popular, to use it for their, the basis for trying to motivate people to go back to the rule. Again, 362 guys are arrested, imprisoned, and only 5 are found guilty of Joachimism. Obviously, Joachimism was not what they were clinging to. For them, it was not about the heresy of Joachimism being heretics. For them, it was a matter of trying to live the rule, trying to be faithful to St. Francis. And they, in fact, were being persecuted for it. Now, were they really Joachimists and heretics? Probably not. It doesn't look like it when you look at it. It sounds like they were just guys trying to be faithful to St. Francis, trying to live the rule with fidelity, and unfortunately got wrapped up with Joachimism and trying to use Joachimist thoughts to explain their position, and they wound up being targeted as Joachimists. What began as being spiritualists, of trying to live the rules spiritually, literally, turned out to be spiritualists as in being a Joachimist. And that's where all the controversy lied. That's where the confusion set in. I don't believe that anybody but these 6 guys, maybe 7, were true Joachimists. I do believe that they should not have never played with Joachimism, that enough of Francis's own writings to defend themselves. But again, on their defense, they were trying to get the friars to understand that they had strayed from the rule and they needed to return to the rule and return to the early life. If we were to look at what the Second Vatican Council said, it's a radical call. The Second Vatican Council said nothing more than what these friars were asking for. When the Second Vatican Council asked us to return to the primitive inspiration of the rule of the founder and to bring it into contemporary society, it was doing nothing more than calling the Franciscans in every order to renew themselves and go back to the early foundations and get rid of all that stuff that had packed on over the years. That's what the spirituals were trying to do. And in the end, it didn't turn out so good for them. Now, was it over? No way. It was not over. The spirituals were crushed, and they no longer clung to Joachimism. But the desire and the thirst to live the rule as St. Francis gave it, the desire to live the primitive inspiration as given by the founder, the desire to embrace the charism as St. Francis gave it, to live the rule according to the Testament, it was now not over, nor will ever be over for the Franciscans. The Carthusians may boast of never reform, never deform. The Franciscans boast of semper reformati, always reforming, So we're going to see in the next section, next class, we're going to talk about the conventuals and the observance. And we're going to see the clash, the new fight, the new battle for the fight for reform, the new battle to go back to Francis's life. And we're going to see how that ends up and how that takes place and all that happened. And so we should be coming to that the closure of this section of history. And then the new battles that'll begin in the 16th century. So hopefully the next class will cover, next couple classes, we'll cover these years from 1318 to 1517. So we have 200 more years to cover before we'll sidetrack and start our next class on the Capuchin Reform. Okay? All right, everybody. God bless, and see you next class.